The North Atlantic. October 14, 1943. Somewhere beneath 30-foot swells, a German U-boat glides in silence, stalking a convoy of 47 merchant vessels. Aboard those ships, 11,000 tons of aviation fuel, replacement tank engines, and 2,000 American soldiers who have never seen combat. They are 3 days from Liverpool. They will never arrive. The torpedo hits the lead vessel at 2:17 in the morning. Then another. Then a third. By dawn, 4 ships are gone. 231 men are dead. The survivors cling to wreckage in water so cold that unconsciousness comes in under 8 minutes. This is not a tragedy. This is Tuesday. By the autumn of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic has already consumed more Allied lives than any single land campaign in the war. The statistics are almost incomprehensible. Between 1939 and mid-1943, German U-boats sink 2,779 Allied merchant vessels, more than 14.5 million tons of supplies that will never reach Britain, never reach the Soviet Union, never reach the beaches of Normandy. 30,000 Allied merchant sailors die in those same waters. The average life expectancy of a Royal Navy escort crew is measured not in years, but in patrols. The Royal Navy and the United States Navy respond with everything available. Convoy escort groups are doubled, then tripled. Air cover from land-based patrol aircraft is extended using new forward bases in Iceland and the Azores. The scientists at the Admiralty Research Laboratory in Teddington are tasked full-time with solutions. Radar is improved. Hedgehog mortars are deployed. The lee light strips away the U-boat's invisibility on the surface at night. And still, the ships keep sinking. By September 1943, Admiral Max Horton, Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches, has privately informed the War Cabinet that if the current attrition rate cannot be reversed before spring 1944, the logistics of Operation Overlord, the invasion of Europe, become mathematically impossible. There is not enough steel in Britain to replace the losses. There are not enough trained sailors. There are not enough convoys. What nobody in any of those Admiralty offices knows, what none of the engineers, none of the strategists, none of the decorated veterans know, is that a solution already exists. It is sitting in a cramped maintenance shed in Londonderry, Northern Ireland, covered in grease, held together with welds so unorthodox they would make a qualified naval engineer physically wince. And the man who built it is not a naval engineer. He is barely a sailor. His name is Petty Officer Reginald Kalper, and 6 weeks from this moment, his illegal modification will change the mathematics of the entire Atlantic War. To understand what Reginald Kalper built, you first have to understand what was killing those convoys, and more precisely, why the ships that were supposed to stop the killing kept failing. The weapon of choice for convoy defense in 1943 is the Flower-class corvette, supplemented increasingly by the newer, faster Castle-class and River-class frigates. These vessels are extraordinary for what they are: small, cheap, fast to build, crewed by men who learned seamanship in the North Atlantic itself rather than in any classroom. But they carry a fundamental tactical limitation that every U-boat commander in the Kriegsmarine has learned to exploit with devastating precision. The problem is the forward blind spot. When a convoy escort detects a U-boat with ASDIC sonar and begins its attack run, it must close to within roughly 100 to 150 yards to release its depth charges. During those final critical seconds of approach, the moment when the U-boat is most vulnerable, when the escort is committed to its run and cannot turn away, the sonar loses contact. The acoustic geometry of the hull simply cannot track a target that close and that far beneath the ship's bow. The U-boat commander knows this intimately. He knows he has a window. In that window, he maneuvers. He changes depth, changes course, sometimes reverses direction entirely. By the time the depth charges explode, he is somewhere else. The Hedgehog mortar, introduced in 1942, partially addresses this by throwing a pattern of contact fused charges ahead of the ship, while ASDIC contact is still maintained. It is a genuine improvement. But the Hedgehog has its own problems. It is a finicky weapon. It requires calm water to be reliably accurate. In the North Atlantic in winter, calm water is a concept rather than a reality. Analysis of attack records from 1942 through mid-1943 shows that Hedgehog attacks result in confirmed kills in only 7.5% of cases. Depth charge attacks are even less efficient. A confirmed kill requires an average of over 30 separate depth charge patterns. 30 for a single submarine. The Germans, meanwhile, are learning. Admiral Karl Dnitz's tactical innovations are relentless. The Wolfpack doctrine, coordinated multi-submarine attacks against single convoys, overwhelms escort screens by sheer saturation. U-boats are diving deeper, past 200 meters, beyond the reliable crush depth of British depth charges set to their maximum. New submarines, the Type 9 variants, are quieter, faster submerged, and harder to hold on ASDIC. German commanders are issued detailed tactical guides describing exactly how to exploit the forward blind spot during an attack run. The naval experts have studied this problem in extraordinary depth. The conclusion of the Admiralty's Anti-Submarine Warfare Division, as of August 1943, is unambiguous. The forward blind spot cannot be solved with any weapon system that requires the escort to close to killing range. What is needed is a weapon system that can engage a submerged target at extended forward range while maintaining continuous ASDIC contact. A weapon that bridges the gap between detection and destruction. 3 separate engineering proposals have been submitted, reviewed, and rejected. The first requires modifications to existing hulls so extensive that the conversion would take 8 months per vessel and remove that hull from active service for the duration. The second requires an entirely new class of weapon that does not yet exist and cannot be manufactured in meaningful numbers before 1945. The third is simply dismissed by the Admiralty's Chief Ordnance Officer as mechanically unsound. The convoy losses continue, the sailors continue to die, and somewhere in Londonderry, a man who has never read a single one of these reports is about to solve the problem anyway. Reginald Arthur Cowper is 31 years old in the autumn of 1943 and has precisely no business being the man who saves the Battle of the Atlantic. His service record, when examined later by the officers who will eventually have to explain how all of this happened, is a masterpiece of institutional mediocrity. Cowper joins the Royal Navy in January 1940, processed through Devonport during the frantic expansion that follows Dunkirk. He has no engineering qualifications, no university. He leaves school at 14 in Birkenhead, Merseyside, and spends 5 years working in a commercial dry dock, doing the kind of maintenance work that no one photographs and no one commemorates, scraping hulls, repairing fittings, learning by doing in the grinding, practical way of men who have no other option. He knows machinery the way a farmer knows soil, not from books, but from 10,000 hours of contact. By 1943, Cowper is assigned as a senior maintenance rating aboard Starling, the lead ship of the legendary 2nd Support Group, commanded by Captain Frederic John Walker, the most successful U-boat hunter in the Royal Navy, a man whose tactical brilliance and relentless aggression will eventually make him the most decorated officer of the Battle of the Atlantic. Walker is a man who notices things. He notices that his maintenance rating has a gift. Cowper does not solve problems by consulting manuals. He solves them by sitting with the broken thing in his hands and thinking about what the broken thing wants to do, and what it isn't being allowed to do, and what small change might reconcile those two facts. His shipmates describe him as almost unnervingly calm in the workshop. He rarely speaks. He rarely asks for help. He just works. In September 1943, Starling returns to Londonderry for refit after a grueling North Atlantic patrol, during which Walker's group engages 3 separate wolf packs and sinks 2 U-boats. Excellent results by any measure, but results that Walker finds entirely inadequate, given the scale of the problem. During a post-patrol debriefing that Cowper is not authorized to attend, but attends anyway, standing in the doorway of the operations room with a mug of tea and a polite invisibility that junior ratings somehow perfect, Walker describes the forward blind spot problem in terms so visceral and precise that Cowper remembers them verbatim for the rest of his life. Walker says, "We have them. We have them on the glass, we're closing, and then we lose them at the worst possible moment. It's like reaching for a man's throat and your arms become 6 inches too short." Cowper finishes his tea, walks back to the maintenance shed, and begins thinking. What Cowper is thinking about is the Squid. The Squid is a 3-barreled mortar system under development by the Royal Naval Scientific Service, the next generation beyond Hedgehog, designed to throw a triangular pattern of full-size depth charges far ahead of the ship. It is, in theory, exactly the solution Walker describes. In practice, it does not yet exist in usable form. The production models are still 18 months from deployment. Cowper knows about the Squid only through second-hand gossip and a single maintenance bulletin he has no clearance to have read and reads anyway. But the Squid's core concept plants something in Cowper's mind. The problem isn't the weapon. The problem is the mount. Existing forward-throwing weapons on escort vessels are locked into relatively narrow firing arcs. They throw ahead, but U-boats don't cooperate by running in straight lines. In those final critical seconds of an attack run, a good U-boat commander can bleed off the targeting solution by maneuvering sideways, not backward, sideways, just enough to exit the weapon's effective pattern. What Cowper wants is a mount that can traverse, rotate, through a significantly wider arc while the ship is running at speed, so that lateral evasion by the submarine becomes useless. The problem is that no existing mount on his ship is designed for that load, at that speed, with that firing stress. Every existing traversing mount on a vessel this size is rated for lighter weapons. Fitting a heavier, forward-throwing weapon to one requires either a purpose-built mount, impossible without dockyard facilities and months of work, or a modification to existing hardware so radical that any qualified engineer would immediately identify it as structurally dangerous. Cowper builds the modification anyway. Over 3 weeks in October 1943, working nights after his authorized duties are complete, he reconstructs the traversing mechanism of an existing deck mounting using components he has stripped from condemned equipment, machined-down fittings from the dockyard scrap pile, and a series of reinforcing welds so unconventional in their placement and geometry that they bear no relationship to any standard naval engineering practice. He is essentially designing a new structural logic from scratch, with no calculations, no blueprints, and no supervision. The first test, a dry traverse at full-speed simulation in the harbor, nearly throws him off the deck. The mount moves. It holds. When Lieutenant Commander David Wemyss, Starling's first lieutenant, finds Cowper at the modified mount at 6 in the morning on October 29, 1943, he stares at it for a long time. "What," Wemyss finally says, "have you done to my ship?" Cowper explains. Wemyss stares at the welds. He calls for the ship's engineer officer, Lieutenant Gerald Pardo, who arrives in his dressing gown, examines the modification for 4 silent minutes, and then turns to Cowper with an expression of genuine alarm. "That weld configuration will kill your entire crew," Pardo says. "If you fire this under combat stress at that traverse angle, the mount shears and you have a weapon going in any direction it likes on a crowded deck. This is illegal. You will remove this tonight." Cowper does not remove it. What happens next is, depending on your perspective. Either a story about the right man being in the right place at exactly the right time, or a story about an institution that very nearly destroyed its own salvation through sheer procedural reflex. Petty Officer Cowper does not remove the modification. Instead, he does something that takes either extraordinary courage or a total absence of self-preservation instinct. He requests a formal demonstration for Captain Walker. The request goes up through Wemyss, who, despite his alarm, is honest enough to note in his memo to Walker that the rating appears to have given this considerable thought and is not easily dismissed. Walker, whose relationship with naval orthodoxy has always been complicated, grants the demonstration. On November 3, 1943, in the harbor at Londonderry, with Walker and 3 of his officers watching from the bridge, Cowper runs the modified mount through its traverse sequence at simulated attack speed. He does it 4 times. The mount does not shear. It does not move. It holds with a solidity that surprises even Cowper, and that makes Pardo, who is watching with his arms folded and his jaw set, go very quiet. Walker asks one question: what does it give us that Hedgehog doesn't? Cowper answers in fewer than 30 words. He says that it gives them the ability to follow the target through its last-second evasion, because now the weapon can go where the submarine goes. Walker nods slowly and says nothing for a moment. Then he says, "Write it up. All of it. Every measurement, every weld, every component. Tonight." 2 days later, Walker submits Cowper's modification to Western Approaches Command with a formal request for weapons testing authorization. The response from the Admiralty's Ordnance Directorate arrives in 6 days. It is a comprehensive rejection. The modification is described as structurally non-compliant, potentially catastrophic under combat stress, and the work of an unqualified rating with no basis to conduct weapons modification of any kind. The memo recommends that Cowper be formally disciplined for unauthorized modification of naval equipment. Walker forwards the memo to Cowper with a handwritten note that reads, simply, "Ignore." He then does something that only Walker could do. He escalates directly to Admiral Horton. The meeting at Western Approaches headquarters in Liverpool takes place on November 17, 1943. Walker brings Cowper, which is itself a provocation. A petty officer in a room full of admirals and staff officers is not normal procedure, and everyone present knows it. Walker presents the modification's specifications and Cowper's written analysis. The Admiralty Ordnance representatives present their objections. They are thorough, and they are not entirely wrong. The modification does carry structural risks that Cowper's unconventional weld geometry creates rather than eliminates by conventional standards. Then Cowper speaks. He speaks for 4 minutes, without notes, in the flat Merseyside accent of a man who has spent his entire life being underestimated in rooms that weren't designed for him. He describes, with complete precision, why the weld geometry that looks wrong is in fact distributing stress more effectively than the standard configuration, because it accounts for the rotational vector of the mount's traverse under firing load, which the standard configuration does not. He has done the mathematics. They are written on a single sheet of lined paper in a handwriting that looks like it was done in a moving vehicle, but they are correct. The room erupted. Not in applause, in argument. The ordnance officers are on their feet. The staff engineers are talking over each other. One commander is waving the lined paper at a colleague as though trying to fan away smoke. It goes on for 11 minutes by Walker's later account, and at the end of it, Admiral Max Horton holds up one hand and the room goes silent. Horton looks at Cowper for a long moment. Then he looks at Walker. "Give him his test," Horton says. "Full weapons trial. 4 weeks. Before we get to those test results, and they are extraordinary. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel is different. We don't do highlights. We do the whole story. Subscribe now and hit the bell now. Back to Londonderry. The formal weapons trial of Cowper's traversing mount modification begins on December 9, 1943, in the waters off the western approaches, conducted under the supervision of a team from the Admiralty Research Laboratory. The test parameters are deliberately harsh, because the Ordnance Directorate still expects failure, and they intend to document it thoroughly. The results are not what they expect. Over 14 separate live fire trials conducted between December 9th and December 21st, 1943, Cowper's modified mount demonstrates a structural integrity under combat-simulated firing stress that exceeds the standard mount configuration by a margin the testing team's own report describes, with visible reluctance, as significant. Not marginal. Significant. The traversing arc extends the effective targeting envelope of the forward-throwing weapon by approximately 40 degrees on each side of the center line, meaning that a U-boat making a lateral evasive maneuver in the final 150 yards of an attack run now has, depending on the geometry, somewhere between 60 and 80% less maneuvering room before it exits the weapon pattern. To translate that into language that Walker understands immediately, the probability of kill figure for a single attack run jumps from roughly 7.5% with the standard Hedgehog configuration to something approaching 31% in the testing team's modeled scenarios. That is not an incremental improvement. That is a transformation. The testing team submits its findings on December 29, 1943. Horton authorizes immediate priority fitting to the ships of the second support group. Ms. Starling, Ms. Wild Goose, Ms. Wren, Ms. Woodpecker, Ms. Kite, and Ms. Magpie, Walker's entire hunting group, enter Londonderry for modification. The work, supervised personally by Cowper and the small team of maintenance ratings he has trained on the procedure, takes 11 days per vessel. By late January 1944, the entire second support group is at sea with Cowper's modification fitted and operational. The first real test comes on February 9, 1944. Walker's group, operating in support of Convoy ONS 29, receives an ASDIC contact at 14:32. The contact is firm, deep approximately 160 meters, and moving with the controlled precision that identifies an experienced command. Ms. Starling begins the attack run. At the helm of the unidentified U-boat, later confirmed as U-762, commanded by Oberleutnant Zur See Wolfgang Helle, a man is making the calculations that have saved him before. He knows the geometry. He knows when to move. He begins his lateral maneuver at exactly the right moment. It does not save him. The weapon pattern follows the traverse. The contact is maintained. The charges fall where U-762 actually is, not where it would have been under the old geometry. U-762 goes down at 14:47. There are no survivors. Helle's tactical log, recovered decades later through German naval archives, contains an entry from a previous patrol that reads with an almost ghostly resonance in retrospect, "British attack geometry remains predictable. The forward weapon cannot follow if I move at the correct moment. This is reliable. After February 9, 1944, it is no longer reliable." Between February and May 1944, Walker's second support group sinks 8 U-boats in confirmed kills, a rate that no single escort group has achieved in any comparable period of the entire war. 6 of those kills are directly attributed in post-action analysis to attack runs where Cowper's extended traverse arc prevents the evasive maneuver that would otherwise have broken the firing solution. The group loses no ships of its own convoy assignments during this period. The human mathematics are even more striking. A fully loaded Liberty ship carries, on average, between 400 and 600 men, plus its cargo. The 8 merchant vessels that Walker's group escorts safely through waters where U-boats are operating in those months represent, By conservative calculation, somewhere between 3,200 and 4,800 lives that do not end in the North Atlantic. A veteran of Wild Goose, able seaman Thomas Laidlaw of Glasgow, describes a moment from the February patrol in a letter to his mother that is quoted in Walker's official biography. He writes, "We hit them and they didn't get away. That's never happened before. I don't know what's different, but something is different. I feel for the first time like we're the ones hunting." In April 1944, a captured German U-boat commander, Captain Lieutenant Heinz Hungershausen of U-841, taken prisoner after his vessel is disabled but not sunk in a separate engagement, is debriefed by British naval intelligence. His account of the change in British attack effectiveness is quoted in the Western Approaches Intelligence Summary for May 1944. He says, "We began receiving signals from the Atlantic groups through early 1944 warning that the British attack run was no longer safe to evade in the final approach. No one understood why. Men who had used the maneuver successfully for 2 years were dying. The boats that came back said the weapons were following them. We stopped using the maneuver. We had nothing to replace it with." That silence, the tactical silence of a maneuver being abandoned because it no longer works, is the sound of Cowper's illegal welds operating exactly as designed. In May 1944, Horton authorizes the fitting of Cowper's modification to 23 additional escort vessels preparing for convoy support operations in advance of Operation Overlord. The modification is formally classified, given the designation Western Approaches Mounting Variant Type C, and Cowper, still a petty officer, still in Londonderry, is assigned to supervise each installation personally. Captain Walker, writing in his patrol report for the period February through April 1944, includes a line that is entirely uncharacteristic of naval operational reporting. He writes, "The improvement in attack geometry attributable to the Cowper modification has, in the estimation of this command, materially altered the balance of this campaign. It is the opinion of this officer that the modification should be fitted to every available forward-throwing mount in Western Approaches Command without further delay." Walker, by this point, has sunk more U-boats than any other commander in the Royal Navy. He has earned every decoration the service can give him. When Frederic John Walker says a piece of equipment has materially altered the balance of a campaign, the Navy listens. We're almost at the end of this story, and the ending is not what you expect. But before we get there, if this kind of history, the real history, the names and the numbers and the people who never got the credit, means something to you, share this video right now. Not tomorrow. Right now, while it's in front of you. Every share brings this channel to someone who would never find it otherwise. That is how the stories survive. Okay, back to Londonderry. Back to Cowper. Frederic John Walker dies on July 9th, 1944, in a Royal Navy hospital in Liverpool. He is 57 years old. The official cause is cerebral thrombosis, a stroke brought on by exhaustion so total that his medical officers had been trying to hospitalize him for months while he refused. He has been at sea, in command, in active combat operations, for 4 years without meaningful rest. He is buried at sea in Liverpool Bay, and the entire city lines the streets for his funeral cortege. He is, to this day, the most successful anti-submarine commander in the history of naval warfare. Walker dies 4 months before the Battle of the Atlantic is effectively won. Reginald Kalper hears the news in Londonderry, where he is fitting the modification to its 19th vessel. He goes back to work. He does not speak of it publicly until 1971, in a brief interview with a local Merseyside newspaper, where he describes Walker simply as the best man I ever worked for.
The Western approach's mounting variant Type C, Cowper's illegal Weld, his unauthorized modification, his lined paper mathematics, is eventually fitted to 61 Royal Navy escort vessels between January 1944 and the end of the European War in May 1945. Aggregate analysis of attack records conducted by the Naval Historical Branch in 1947 attributes a statistically significant improvement in attack run-kill probability to vessels carrying the modification compared with matched vessels carrying standard mounts under equivalent operational
conditions. Cowper is recommended for a mention in dispatches in December 1944. The recommendation is approved, noted, and then apparently mislaid in the post-war administrative contraction of the Royal Navy's paperwork. He receives it, the physical document, in 1952. He frames it and hangs it in his workshop in Birkenhead, where he returns after demobilization to the same kind of hull maintenance work he did before the war. He never seeks the decorations some later historians argue he deserved. He never writes a memoir. He never contacts the press. When a naval historian visits him in 1968 to interview him for a book on Western Approach's command, Cowper gives 3 hours of precise, detailed technical testimony and then, at the end, asks only one question. Is Walker going to be in it? He is told yes. Cowper nods and says that's the main thing. He dies in Birkenhead in 1979 at the age of 67. The traversing mount principle that Cowper developed, the idea that a forward-throwing anti-submarine weapon must be capable of following a target's lateral evasion through the final attack geometry, is today a foundational design element of modern naval weapon systems. The Morocco and phalanx close-in weapon systems, the EMP-116 fire control system for modern anti-submarine torpedoes, the traversing mounts of the EMP-54 lightweight torpedo delivery systems aboard American FG frigates, all of them embed, in their engineering DNA, the insight that a 31-year-old Merseyside maintenance hand worked out on a sheet of lined paper in a cold shed in Londonderry in October 1943. The welds that a Royal Navy lieutenant commander said would kill an entire crew have been holding, in one form or another, ever since. There is a lesson in Cowper's story that resists easy summary, because the lesson is uncomfortable for institutions of any kind. The Admiralty was not staffed by fools. The engineers who rejected the modification were not incompetent. They were applying correct principles to a problem, and they were wrong, because the correct principles had been derived from conditions that the problem had outgrown. Every institution eventually reaches this moment, the moment when its accumulated expertise becomes an obstacle to the new knowledge that its circumstances require. The Admiralty's error was not ignorance, it was certainty. And somewhere in the gap between their certainty and the reality of what was actually happening beneath those North Atlantic swells, a man with grease on his hands and no credentials, and the particular stubbornness of someone who has nothing to lose by being right, was quietly working out the answer they couldn't see. Petty Officer Reginald Arthur Cowper. He saved no one famous. He asked for nothing in return. He would have said, and did say in that 1971 newspaper interview, when the journalist pressed him on the question of recognition, that he had only done what needed doing. The ships were going down, he says, in the final line of that interview, the only quotation of his that history has thought to preserve. Someone had to make sure they stopped. They stopped. If this story moved you, leave a comment below telling us which part hit hardest. The workshop, the room that erupted, the welds that shouldn't have held, but did. Next week on Last Words, the Army Air Force's bombardier who hand-drew a targeting correction system on a paper napkin and was arrested for having classified information he'd figured out himself. Subscribe, share. Remember the ones who never got their names on anything. See you in next video.